Hi everybody, and welcome back to the sixth and final edition of our Lenten Text Study for the year 2024. We've been following the theme between our rock and hard places here at St. Mark. I'm Mark Davis, the pastor here, and this will be our final lesson video as well as discussion throughout this season. Now, we're coming up on a very odd weekend, because on the Saturday and Sunday coming up, we will cover both the Palm Sunday reading, which is from Mark chapter 11, and part of the Passion story. The Passion story is incredibly long and is not something that we can cover here in 30 minutes by any means. So what I've decided to do today is this video is going to cover the Palm Sunday story from Mark chapter 11. Wednesday's discussion is going to cover parts of the Passion story from Mark chapters 14 and 15. Even in that 1 hour discussion, I think we'd be fooling ourselves to think we can cover the whole thing. So I will select parts of that we will give a little closer look on Wednesday. Also on Wednesday, we'll circle back to the Palm Sunday text and just see what kind of questions you might have or what interesting things you might want to discuss from that. So again, this is the final edition. We're not going to be meeting during Holy Week. There are already enough things happening during that week. So if you have any questions, you can contact us here. I do want to say thank you all for hanging in there all these weeks. This has been, I think, an interesting 6 weeks together, and I hope you have found it that way as well. So we're going to read from Mark chapter 11, verses 1 through 11, the story that we often call the triumphal entry. It's the story that is the basis of our Palm Sunday celebration. It's a story that shows up in all four Gospels. We're not going to do a lot of comparative look at that. We have done that in the past. We're going to look mostly at Mark's Gospel. And before we do that, I want to contextualize this story within Mark's greater story. So in chapters 1 through 10, Mark has located Jesus either in and around Galilee, and at the very end of those chapters, en route to Jerusalem. So most of what's happening in chapters 1 through 10 are in the Galilean region. So if you know the map of the greater Israel, Galilee would be that northern portion of what we typically collectively call Israel. Judah would be the southern portion, and then there's Samaria somewhere in the middle of it. We've been in Galilee almost all the way through, and you'll remember that in these first 10 chapters, there are three very important moments in chapters 8, 9, and 10. And that is in chapter 8, the first disclosure that Jesus makes, that he's going to go to Jerusalem, which is in Judea, and there he'll be rejected and killed, and on the third day raised. He makes that same disclosure in chapter 9, and then for the third time in chapter 10. The disciples respond badly each time, but that's the dynamic going on here, is Jesus is, starting in chapter 8, really turning them toward the journey to Jerusalem. And in chapter 10, the very first verse says, he left that place and went into the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. So that's where we see Jesus en route to Jerusalem, because as I said, Jerusalem's down in Judea. So Jesus is on his way by the time chapter 10 happens. And then chapters 11 through 15 in Mark's Gospel constitute what we call the last week of Jesus' life, following the title of a book by Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan. Mark is very deliberate to say which day we're on. This day this happened, the next day that happened, and so forth. Our reading is verses 1 through 11. Verse 12 begins with the phrase, on the next day. So we know that Mark is demarcating each of those days very specifically. And then you get to chapter 16, which is the final chapter in Mark's Gospel. And at least in its original manuscript, it ended with verse 8, a very enigmatic ending. And then verses 9 through 21 have been added in stages later. And that's the resurrection story in chapter 16. So that's the layout, right? The first 10 chapters were in and around Galilee, then starting to make our way to Judea. And chapters 11 through 15, we're going to enter into Jerusalem in chapter 11. And this is where the drama happens that ultimately ends with the crucifixion in chapter 15. And then chapter 16 is the resurrection. That's a really helpful way of thinking about how Mark's story unfolds all along. So let's get to reading our chapter 11. We'll start with the first 3 verses. When they were approaching Jerusalem at Bethphage and Bethany near the Mount of Olives, he sent 2 of his disciples and said to them, "Go into the village ahead of you, and immediately as you enter it, you will find tied there a colt that has never been ridden. Untie it and bring it. If anyone says to you, 'Why are you doing this?' just say this, 'The Lord needs it, and will send it back here immediately.'" So these first 3 verses I just want to call the instruction. We can look on Wednesday if you want to at the locations of Bethany and Bethphage and the Mount of Olives. I didn't feel like they warranted much attention here in this video, but they are instructed, go find a colt, and it specifically said an unsat colt, a colt on which no person has ever sat, is kind of how it literally reads. So, what's the significance of the fact that no one has ever sat on this colt before? I'm not entirely sure. There's much about this story that I find curious and don't have a lot of confidence in what exactly Mark is communicating. I don't really know the significance of the fact that no one's ever sat on this colt. It could just be a way of reinforcing that it's young. It's a colt and not a full-grown donkey. Is it a way of saying that the rider is the first one to ride on this colt? That's a triumphant thing. Remember that word, triumphant. Is it showing the triumphant nature of the rider, that he has bragging rights of being the first to ever ride this colt? Or is it the opposite? Is it a notation of humility? This is not a steed that has been in battle. It's not a battle horse or anything. It's a colt of a donkey. Is the point there that he's not a warrior, but is humble? There are reasons to think humility is the point, because this does seem to be an echo of the book of Zechariah. Some of the other Gospels will specifically mention that. And Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9 says, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter Jerusalem. Lo, your king comes to you. Triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." So if this expectation is that we're revisiting Zechariah chapter 9, then the colt is a sign of triumphal king, victorious king riding humbly on a donkey. So maybe it's supposed to be enigmatic in some ways, and kind of a curious admixture of both triumph and humility. So you have that. They were to go find a colt on which no one has ever sat. I don't know how that identification helps them. Maybe it means it's not saddled in any sort of way. I don't know. And as they go, Jesus says, if they ask you, what are you doing with the colt? You tell them that the Lord needs it. All right. That the Lord has need of it. It's curious as to what exactly that means. This is only one of 2 places where the phrase the Lord with the definite article the arises in Mark's gospel. The first is in the 5th chapter, seems to be referring to God, and then here. And it's hard to say. I mean, the word Lord is used often in Mark's gospel. Sometimes it's used of Jesus, sometimes of God, sometimes of just an honorable person, like you would use sir or senor or something like that. And so the Lord has need of it. Which Lord has need of it? What does that phrase mean? There are some possibilities out there, and I'm mostly reflecting things I've read from others. I don't pretend to have the insight here. On the one hand, Borg and Crossan make the point that this is all prearranged, that Jesus has already made the arrangements for this, and now he's getting 2 of his disciples to carry it out. So the fact that they say the Lord has need of it might be like a special code of some sort, a secret password, as it were, that when Jesus set this up, they say, well, how do we know, who your disciples are? And the answer is, they're going to say this, the Lord has need of it. Something like that. Others have pointed out that there was a Roman practice of conscription, where a Roman could tell a Jew or anybody under their occupation to carry their burden for a mile, and you had to do it. And in the crucifixion story, the Romans conscripted Simon of Cyrene to carry the cross when Jesus was faltering under it. Likewise, the Romans could also conscript your animal, a beast of burden, as it were, and use it. And you had to give it to them. And in that conscription, apparently the phrase was often, the Lord has need of it. Your superior has need of it. So this would be like pulling rank with people and saying, I'm conscripting this animal for now. Now, it could be that the people overseeing the cult are already Jesus' followers in some way, and when they see someone messing with this cult and untying it and ask what you're up to, and they hear the Lord has need of it, they're already supporting Jesus, so they're fine with that. I'm tempted to hear it as something like Jedi magic, like in Star Wars when he says, you shall let us pass, and suddenly the guard goes, you shall pass, right? Maybe there's some kind of special power in that phrase that the people with the cult, for reasons unknown to them, are like, sure, okay, use this cult. But whatever happens, in the instructions, we're told that when people ask you what you're doing, the response is the Lord has need of it, and they will let it happen. So that's kind of curious. So that's the instruction part, and now we're going to see the execution. Okay? Verses 4 through 6. They went away and found a colt tied near a door outside in the street. And as they were untying it, some of the bystanders said to them, what are you doing, untying the colt? And they told them what Jesus had said, and they allowed them to take it. All right, so this is where they actually carry out what they've been told to do. There are some similarities in verses 1 through 3 and 4 through 6 of what they've been told and what they actually did. Verse 2 says they're going to find a bound colt, and they did. It says they should loose it, and they did. They should bring it, and they did. So actually in verse 7, we'll say they brought it to Jesus. So far, the similarities are there. In verse 3, we heard from the instructions that they're going to be challenged, and that they were, and that they can answer. But there are also some small differences in the plan, the instructions, and the execution. In the execution, it says nothing about the fact that the colt has never been ridden or sat on before. So I don't know why that was part of the instruction, if it's not part of the execution. And I don't know how helpful that was as part of the instruction for people looking for a colt. I don't know how you can tell. Verse 4. You remember in the instruction it says, when you enter the city, immediately you'll find a colt tied. In verse 4, it doesn't say that. It says that it was at a crossroad, basically, by a door, that they saw a colt tied. And then in verse 6, in the execution, these are the differences. The words that they say, the Lord has need of it, they don't say them in the execution. It just says, they told him what the Lord said. And so we don't have a quote like we do in verse 3, but instead we just have an accounting that they said what they were told to say. And that the people watching the colt then gave them permission to take it away. So that phrase, the Lord has need of it, while it is somewhat curious in itself as to exactly what the referent is and what that means, how we're supposed to hear it, it doesn't even actually show up in the execution. But that's just something to note. I don't know what to make of it, and it may just be the way stories are told. So let's move on then to the more interesting part, perhaps, the parade itself. Then they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their cloaks on it, and he sat on it. Many people spread their cloaks on the road, and others spread leafy branches that they had cut in the fields. Then those who went ahead and those who followed were shouting, Hosanna! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. Hosanna in the highest heaven. All right. So this is what I would just call the parade. And it's got some kind of interesting details on it, doesn't it? First of all, they put their clothes on the colt, to kind of a makeshift saddle, as it were. And they lined the road with both clothes and leafy branches that they cut from the fields. This is not the gospel that gives us palm branches, but that's much more arresting figure, and so we go with that on Palm Sunday. Here it's leafy branches from the field, and they litter that on the street as well. Personally, I get the clothes on top of the steed as something of a saddle, if that's better. I don't understand the significance of the clothes or the leafy branches in the road. It would seem to me that makes it a harder negotiation. I've heard people try to make arguments that it makes better traction or something like that. My sense, from my experience actually, is that maybe this is a description of a peasant parade. This is what peasants do. They don't have the dancing girls throwing, freshly cut flowers. They don't have the military marching lockstep here and there. This is how peasants do parties. And that is, you use what is at hand and you make them into festive things. So you don't have ribbons, you have an old shirt, you have your cloak, and you throw it down, and this becomes part of the parade. I've seen it with my own eyes, how in poor communities they can throw a party and in fascinating ways use a lot of the things at hand rather than the things that were either made or purchased just for the express purpose of the parade itself. So it could be that this is how you do peasant parades. That might be why we have cloth and branches. Jesus did sit on this donkey, and so now we know he's the very first one to do that. And then Mark makes reference to those who go ahead and those who follow behind shouting. And it draws our attention. What kind of crowd are we looking at here? Mark had prefaced that by saying many people. In Matthew, the phrase is a very large crowd. In Luke, there's the phrase, a whole multitude of disciples. So it just seems like the build is getting bigger and bigger. Here's how John describes it. So the crowd that had been with him when he called Lazarus out of the tomb and raised him from the dead continued to testify. It was also because they had heard that he had performed this sign that the crowd went to meet him. The Pharisees then said to one another, "You see, you can do nothing. Look, the world has gone after him." So, at least when you combine the four witnesses together, we're not just talking about a small little motley crew. You know, this does seem to be a very, very popular movement that's happening there, and therefore potentially a threat. So you have the phrase Hosanna, right? We never know whether to pronounce it Hosanna, Hosanna. That's an interesting term. In the Anchor Bible Dictionary, Marvin Pope argues that Hosanna is actually a misappropriation of a well-known Hebrew praise term. We suppose that it means something like save us. And that's fine. Let's just go with that. Marvin Pope's point is that that's not really the Hebrew term for that. It's kind of a misappropriation. Maybe Mark doesn't really know his Hebrew very well. Maybe Mark only can read the Old Testament by way of the Greek translation of it, the Septuagint, and somehow lost in translation is the purity of this word. But now this is what we have. Richard Horsley says, no, this is what is intended in the Hebrew Bible, particularly in those psalms that are called Hallel Psalms. And those were psalms that would be shouted or sung at the Feast of Tabernacles or Passover. So, if you're saying Hosanna, and if the word Hosanna is what is shouted at the Passover, and now we're in the season of Passover, the actual meal itself, festival itself is coming up. What that can mean is that we're at a very dangerous time for the imperial rulers over Jerusalem, because Passover is a remembrance of the Exodus story, when the people of Israel, by the power of God, through the leadership of Moses, were led out of slavery in Egypt. They were led out of the empire of Egypt and found their liberation. So if this word Hosanna is part of the Passover celebration, it really could be heard as this large crowd, the world as it were, that is following Jesus with this peasant parade, and lo, he comes riding in on this animal, and they're yelling Hosanna. It could be that we're getting ready to leave the clutches of the empire and to be liberated. Could be very much that. So it's kind of interesting to imagine what the use of this word Hosanna really is all about, since its origin is not crystal clear. So you have three different parts to the shout. First, they shout, Hosanna, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. That's a lovely phrase. The second phrase is, blessed is the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. That sounds a lot more political, right? I would argue that this whole thing is political theater in some way. But that's definitely a political statement there, because they have a king, and his name is not David, and he's not from the Davidic throne. He's from the Herodic throne. And he's part of Herod's lineage. And then you also have a governor, Pontius Pilate. Both of them are there by dint of the Roman Empire. So this idea that now we're instituting a new king, watch, the whole world's going to bring him in and shout this liberation song. That makes this a sparky, dangerous moment. And then the third thing they say is Hosanna in the highest heaven. So the name of the Lord, the highest heaven, I think when we hear that, many people think they're talking spiritually, not politically. I want to say that I don't think that's a clear distinction in the scriptures. And I don't think it's a clear distinction in this story. I think it's only a clear distinction in the minds of 20th and 21st century Christians, particularly Protestants who have grown up in the United States with a separation of church and state. So I don't want to be too quick to say, well, it's a political statement over and against a spiritual statement. I think you can make a spiritual statement and a political statement, and they can be the same statement. So this is a tinderbox in some respects. But let's read this last verse. Now, Jesus said in chapters 8, 9, and 10, he has to go to Jerusalem, he has to die. And in the beginning of chapter 10, he turns toward Judea to get there. We're now entering Jerusalem, and he's entering as this one who comes in the name of the Lord. And then we get this. Then he entered Jerusalem and went into the temple. And when he had looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. Now that is the anticlimactic ending of this story. It's not how the story ends in the other Gospels. It is how it ends here in Mark's Gospel. I'm playing with this whole notion a little bit, thinking of the Latin phrase veni vidi vici, which means I came, I saw, I conquered, often attributed to Julius Caesar, and this time is veni vidi vacati. I came, I saw, I left. It's just done. Now, if you ever see this anywhere, I got dibs on this phrase. I don't know if it's ever been used before, but I kind of made it up myself. Okay, so why does this great story of triumphant, and enigmatic symbolism and phrases of the coming king and all of that, why does this story end so anticlimactically? Jesus walks into the temple, looks around, goes back. It's usually agreed among biblical scholars that this is an anticlimactic ending, but the purpose, the reason for it is hard. There's a very good article by a Swedish biblical interpreter named Hans Leander, who says what we might be seeing here is actually the whole parade is mimicry. It's when you say something that's like but not quite like what it's presenting. It's like a parody of sorts. You don't get a good parody if it's nothing like what you're parodying, right? It has to be very much like it, but not quite like it. So maybe that explains some things. You do have a parade, but it's a peasant parade. You don't have the military, you don't have the dancing girls, you don't have this, you don't have that, right? It's just it's a peasant parade, but it is a parade. He's riding on a steed, but it's a donkey, and it's the colt of a donkey. That's never been ridden before. He's riding on a borrowed donkey with the instruction that he will return it. So it's not like he's conquered and accumulated anything. This is borrowed time. He comes in something like a triumphal leader. We sometimes call this the triumphal entry because that word triumphal comes from Zechariah chapter 9. But Jesus shows up, he looks around, he leaves. It's not, he shows up, he looks around, he conquers. So it helps to remember that Jesus has come to Jerusalem to die. We know that. We know that not because we've read ahead, but because we've read before. And we saw in chapters 8, 9, and 10 This is the whole purpose of coming to Jerusalem. So when Jesus comes in and everybody's shouting Hosanna and stuff, perhaps they're misperceiving what's going on, or perhaps that peasant parade is exactly what it's supposed to be. A mimicry, a mockery of how power is usually exercised. And instead, in this Christ, we're going to see power exercised through giving his life as a ransom for many, which is a whole different way of being the blessed one who comes in the name of the Lord. So, these are stories. There's a lot of imitative imperial language and symbolism in the story, but it does seem that at every turn that symbolism is not quite the same as what a conquering Roman hero might do. So maybe this is a counter story, a mimicry of sorts. I'd be happy to hear your opinion on that on Wednesday before we turn around and look at the Passion story, because we have a lot to cover there as well. So that's it for our video presentations. Our last conversation will be on Wednesday. I hope to see you there. Thanks.